Steve mentioned again, to begin what will be the second part, a three-part set of videos on the creation, kind of from a day age standpoint. Go ahead and at this point, go ahead and go to some slides. So here we are again with creation day by day, looking at how the order of events that we find in Genesis 1 compares to what we find from scientific discoveries that we had so far. Scientific discoveries are always incomplete. There will be more. Ideas will change. But what can we say with what we know at this point? So let's go forward here. I said before that I think the evidence for Christianity comes from kind of three sources, one being God as the creator, one is Jesus being God the Son, his resurrection, and also from the personal experience that he offers each of us a chance to have with him. He offers us a chance to get to know him, and that's a very real part of the support for Christianity as I see it. Well, looking at the creation, let's go forward here. We looked last time at the interpretations that have been proposed by Genesis 1. A lot of Christians have a lot of different ideas about that. But we're looking today particularly at the day age proposal. We look at things that happened before the day one. Now we're going to look at video 2, days 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the next video will deal with 5, 6, and 7. Looking at that first day, what does the Bible tell us? Genesis 1, verses 1 through 5. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, one day. And I'm using the New American Standard Bible. I think it is the most literal translation that we have in general. Each of the days is going to begin with God's word. Then God said, in this case, "Let there be light," and there was light. Remember last time we focused on the fact that when God told us that God's Spirit was hovering on the surface of the waters, this gave us the frame of reference. This told us where the observations are based on. So what we're looking at is the observations as if it was from someone at the surface of the earth. Based on what we've seen, based on the text that we have, what does the Bible say? What does it say was in place at the end of day? It tells us that light was reaching the surface, and the day and night were distinguishable. What do we know from science? Well, the explanation has been given that the gas and dust that were part of the sun and the planets were forming may have cleared out fairly quickly. At least quickly in terms of what time period we're talking about here. Wikipedia says that after between 3 to 10 million years, the young sun's solar wind would have cleared away all the gas and dust from the protoplanetary disk, blowing it into interstellar space, and thus ending the growth of the planet. So a lot of the dust, things that were out in space, might have been cleared away. But what about right around the surface? So what was Earth's early atmosphere like? It's been speculated. Here's an interpretation from 2006, says that it was very hazy. That when could light actually reach the Earth's surface? That's an interesting question. You know, there's a shortage of light meters reporting at that time, so we don't know a lot about that. But we could have to look for some sort of indirect approach. What kind of approach might we use? We could look for plants. When did plants first appear? After all, we know that plants use sunlight to make photosynthesis, and it certainly seems that it appeared pretty early. It seems that there was cyanobacteria, blue-green algae that required light, and they appeared as early as 3.75 billion years ago. It's amazing that as early as conditions that could be stable enough for life, suddenly it's there. That's pretty cool. It narrows down day one, or at least says that the conditions were met pretty early then. What do we know otherwise? Here's a report from 2017 that their interpretation is that the fact that we had early microorganisms very early means that life is really very common in the universe. But is that true? Are the conditions out there that would be conducive to life, and could life appear just on its own? The fact that we had life early, does that really prove that life is out there? Now, it's very possible that life does exist in other parts of the universe, but if it's there, it's because God had to engineer those circumstances, those situations in there very specifically, and He had to create that life. He creates life for His own purpose. So let's see what we know day one. And what do we know? Well, we know that life was reaching the surface, and day and night were distinguishable. When was that possible? The fact that plants appeared suggests that life had to be able to reach the surface, so maybe as early as 3.7 billion years ago when life appears that way. Light was there. So if life was there for day one, let's look at what happens next. Let's look at the second. Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. Okay, what does this mean? It uses words that can sound a little strange to modern ears. Genesis has been described as a historical narrative in pictorial form, which is to say that there were word pictures in this rather than detailed explanations. What kind of word picture would this be talking about? Separating waters from waters, refers to the water in the air from the waters that are in the ocean. Waters in lakes and oceans that way. Put that on a timeline and see what we come up with. What do we know is in place at the end of that day two? Well, we know there's an atmosphere. And we know there's some sort of stable hydrologic cycle. And that's really important for there to be advanced life. We need that type of thing for life to develop and to be able to flourish. This is, again, evidence of God's preparation. We talked about the words about a firmament. What does that mean? Again, Gordon Wenham's commentary is very useful that way. He talks about this. He says, the firmament is defined in the second clause as a divider of the waters. The firmament separates the waters in the sky from the waters from the seas and rivers. And verse 8 is called heaven. Put another way, the firmament occupies the space between the earth's surface and the clouds. So it sounds like at this day we had clouds. We had haze covering the earth's surface. But what do we know by the end of day two? We had some sort of hydrologic cycle. We had clouds up in there. That's an incredible design element that way. Now, how rare this must be in the universe. Earth has a stable cycle, which allows us to have water in the air, water on the land, water in terms of snow. So we have all three phases of water. If we put it on the timeline, if we know at the end of day two there was a stable hydrologic cycle, here's a possible option. It's a window that kind of shows that maybe it was in place 2.3 billion years ago. We'll look at the next day and maybe see if that helps us understand that a little bit better. Let's move to day three. I have to move my picture again. Maybe you could do without my picture. Then God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters He called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, and with seed in them, and on the earth, and it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and plants bearing fruit with seed in them, and after their kind, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a third day. So, what is this a picture of? Is a narrative in pictorial form? Well, scientifically, he's describing the first appearance of rock above water. Scientifically, he's not really particularly describing the first appearance of rock above water. So let's look at what do we know. Moving to our timeline and moving the picture. What do we know is in place at the end of day 3? Well, the continents are in place. Land plants are beginning. The continents are in place. What does that mean? Where did continents come from? Scientists believe that the continental crust comes from the mantle, which has been fractionally differentiated. When did it form? Let's take a look at what we can see, what some of the thinking is now. Here we're looking at data from a report from 2020, and it shows some of the latest thinking. It's based on radiometric dated zircons, and it shows the amount of continental crust, and it's kind of reversed from the way I typically draw the distribution, because it starts with the recent over on the left and then moves back in time to the right. But it shows that the continents have come together many times. But you had a great supercontinent, the first supercontinent appearing about 3 billion years ago. Shows that the amount of crust has a sharp increase that dates to around 2.8 billion years ago. The number of changes that took place around 3 billion years ago. Now, there's a lot of different ideas about this dating. Here's a report. There is first continents known as cratons emerged in the ocean around 3.3 to 3.2 billion years ago, a new study said. And it pushed back, and this pushes back the estimate to from earlier estimates said around 2.5 billion years ago. This is from 2021, it's later. But in any case, around 3 billion years ago, the continental crust seems to have been forming the first supercontinent that prepared Earth for another key step forward for advanced life forms. Let's make a place where you could have the type of life forms that he says are beginning to be created on this day. So the other part of that third creation period, third day, is the creation of land-based life. Now, when did that form? Let's look at when we know it existed. We know it existed by the Devonian time. These are some fossil trees or fossil forests. This is found in upstate New York. And some recent discoveries up in there. Shows that there were trees and forests were in place 393 to 383 million years ago. This was kind of a key turning point in history. It gives us evidence that there were forests covering parts of New York at that period of time. I tend to use this as one of the evidences that these rocks were not formed by any type of global flood, such as some of the young Earth creation models would demand, because these rooted forests were not swept in here by a flood, but they grew in place. This is probably not the first forest, but it does represent some sort of an early development of that. When do we see the emergence of plants on land first? There's an article from 2022 because it proposed that land plants were really important to the changes in the continental crust. Again, it ties some kind of similar timing to the forest that we saw up in New York. It's around 430 million years ago in the Silurian period, so just a little bit older there. And it's interesting that they show a confirmed linkage between land plants on the continents and the composition of the crust. How does long-lived plate tectonics, such as we have on Earth, exist? life has been a part of this. So no plate tectonics, you wouldn't have had advanced life. No life, then you would have had no long-lived plate tectonics. Again, more evidence that God designed things this way, and life is not necessarily common in space unless God created it in other places as well. There were forests almost 400 years ago. What about when did plants actually first come onto the earth? And that's a little difficult to tell. An interesting report came out in 22 that suggests that during the Cambrian time, there actually was an explosion of plants which took place on land, as well as the marine Cambrian explosion that's well known in science. Just to review a little bit, Cambrian explosion, talked about it before, took place around 542 million years ago. Read a description from Encyclopedia Britannica. They say online that it is the unparalleled emergence of organisms between 541 and approximately 530 million years ago at the beginning of the Cambrian period. The event was characterized by the appearance of many of the major phyla, between 20 and 35, that make up modern life. It was largely a marine event, though, taking place in the ocean. But this 2022 article suggests that there was a Cambrian explosion which took place on land. And that would have included early forms of land plants. It's not as well evidenced as the marine explosion. Why would that be? Well, as it works out, we don't find of the non-marine Cambrian and Ordovician and Silurian sediments around the world. There's not as many places where that type of evidence would exist. Why do we not necessarily see the more explicitly, the Cambrian explosion as a big event in Genesis 1? Well, part of that may be the fact that the created animals that were part of this were not created clean. Maybe it would have confused the early Israelites if they were called good. But I think it's interesting that, again, we have only partial accounts that way, and we only have speculation for why certain things are in, certain things were out. But I think tying the land explosion to the Cambrian explosion is a very interesting possibility there. So on a timeline, what would day 3 have looked like? Go back to our timeline here. Again, the continents are in place. Land plants are beginning. We're going to look at this. We're saying that it began fairly early. Might have been one of those long days. Maybe you had one of these days that just seemed to go on forever. But they didn't go on forever, but it certainly was very long if it's interpreted this way. So I'm going to zoom in on that last billion years, what might have been the last part of day 3, and see what we might see there. What type of forms might God have created? So again, the last billion years, we're going to zoom in on a separate slide that way, and we'll look at it. So day 3 has been going on. We said the Cambrian explosion takes place maybe 542 million years ago. There were forests in place by the end of the Devonian time. So again, this part pulls up with the idea that perhaps the Cambrian explosion was the end of day 3 and the beginning of day 4. We don't know that for sure, but certainly there were land plants potential as a part of the Cambrian explosion. Maybe that was day 3. So now we're going to continue to look at these days, and we'll move on to day 4. What does the text tell us? Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens, to give light on the earth." And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. And he made the stars also. And God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. It was evening, and there was morning, a 4th day. So here the frame of reference is really critical. The observations are from the Earth's surface. It doesn't say that God created the sun and moon on the day. It says they were made. It doesn't say exactly when. Here I believe God is assigning a role for the sun and the moon. They're not to be worshipped. God is the creator. And he is the one who has that authority to actually give them, to assign them the roles that they have. He can assign roles to heavenly. What do we know about nature at the end of day 4? We have examples from fairly nearby. An observer, Venus, would know the difference between day and night, but would not actually see the sun and the moon. But what do we know is in place at the end of day 4? The sun and the moon are visible at the Earth's surface. We have sunshine and we have moonshine. Not drink moonshine, by the way. So what things have changed. The cloud cover has parted enough to allow us to be able to see the sun and the moon. How would we recognize it? It's hard to find a rock that demanded that there be sunshine or moonshine, particularly that way. But we do have a proxy for that, because these are important, because more advanced forms actually regulate their clock by the moon. They needed to be able to see those lunar cycles. What can we use? Well, we can think in terms of insects. Insects today at least navigate by the moon. Fossils demonstrate that they were flying actually in what's known as the Pennsylvanian period, around 325 million years ago. This is an article from 2022. It has a nice dragonfly fossil there. Kind of there were insects actually existed before that, but they're not necessarily flying insects. So they existed at least by 385 million years ago. That's the oldest confirmed insect fossil that we have. More discoveries may take place later than this, but certainly by this time, it's very possible that there was actually, the moon was visible, and it was possible to navigate by that. So if we take a look at that on our timeline, perhaps day 4 place look like this. Not quite as long as day 3, but we know at the end of that we had insects. And this would be a proxy. This would be one possibility. This would be a candidate for what that might look like. Who knew that bugs might be able to help us interpret the Bible? So at this point, we have looked through day 1, 2, and 3. We have some candidates for what they may have looked like, when they may have fallen in terms of record. They're falling in order. Now we need to look at the next 2 days and see what creation would have looked like on 5 and 6. We'll do that in the next session. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you come back and join us and get, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story.